He's his own best collaborator, right?
Sometimes. So how collaborative was it when you were working with Frank? Did Frank give you full scripts? How did it work, Marvel style? You know, when you worked on the Daredevil run, how did it work?
We went through several dramatic transitions.
Yes.
I think, roughly, without being very specific about, 14 months or 12 months. But
yes.
The first year Frank was doing very, very tight pencils. Very tight pencils. They were so tight that the first issue... How tight? What a raucous crowd. They were so tight that I would pour ink on the top of the page and just shake the page, and it would drip into the grooves. That's how tight the pencils were. He would dig into those pages.
Yes.
And then after a year, he kind of loosened up a little bit. Well, he loosened up quickly because he was very much in demand and he was doing other work. Then he started doing breakdowns, which is...
So they were a lot looser, obviously.
David, how would you describe it? They're pencils without blacks, right?
There's no need to be racist.
Oh,
No, he just means that...
They're a lot looser, aren't they?
Yeah, it's more of a layout. You know? It's more
yeah.
of a... It doesn't have to have, like... There's a lot of solving that you just leave up to the inker. There's a lot of...
And there were...
Which became a lot of your... a lot of your problem solving went into that.
And do you enjoy the fact that you had more latitude? There's a lot of people, if they have really tight pencils, there's not much you should do when you reach the ink stage, but if they're loose, as David was saying, it's about problem solving at the ink stage and going, I'm going to put my mark on it, and because they're looser, you could go, okay, this is more, it's more of a collaborative effort than rather than pencils and inks, when pencils is tighter. Inks is just finishing people's pencils, basically.
And when you do layouts, when you're working on layouts, you have more to contribute.
Yes.
And which is not to say that inking pencils or type pencils or finished pencils is not creative. I had the occasion recently, I was talking to a lawyer, very, very smart in terms of legal stuff. And she asked me, so what's up with this inking? Is it just tracing?
What?
It's fine because civilians don't get it.
They see it as just tracing.
And I was kind of flabbergasted. The only thing I could come back with is, well, inking is a creative thing.
Yes.
There is a contribution to make. But after Frank got to the kind of the layout page stage, he started drawing on typewriter paper, which was amazing.
Wow.
Have you ever seen those?
No, because it's much smaller too.
Yeah, they're typewriter paper, and he would draw the outline of the page, and then divide the page into panels, draw the interior with the dialogue. And what was amazing, and I'm not sure exactly how he did this, but the dialogue was it.
There
was no crossing out.
Seriously?
Yeah, and I don't know if he went through earlier stages with that, but then I would take that and I would draw it up, and sometimes change a little bit. But Frank and I would talk a lot about that particular stage that we were at.
Yes.
Also because Frank, at that time, he lived like 3 blocks from where I lived, or I lived 3 blocks from where he was. So we were able to really see each other and talk about the work and collaborate. I learned a lot from him.
And then, of course, you moved on to to doing full art.
Right.
So what was the transition like?
I also colored the last year.
Yes. I mean, that was a magnificent run. Again, it was beautiful. And it really, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not knocking, the previous run was also amazing, but suddenly it went to like another level. When Frank was scripting and you were drawing, it was incredible.
There's some, let me say this, and David, please, be quiet. I was up in the office one day up at Marvel.
Yes.
I think it's when they were up at Park Avenue.
Yes.
And Joe Quesada was behind his desk, and Alex Maleev had come in, and we were just hanging around, and Alex Maleev was taking pictures,
Yes.
as was his wont, certainly at that moment. And I realized, oh, all three of us had done Daredevil. And the funny thing about acknowledging that is that Joe and Alex and I both individually thought this was our character.
Yeah.
And I felt immediately competitive with Joe and Alex about, you know, who had the better run or
Yeah.
who did the better Daredevil.
Yes.
But there's something about Daredevil that makes you possessive about the character.
Wow.
And it was really hard to, I think, let it go until End of Days, which I
Wow.
was extremely happy to be.
So was it nice to come back to the character after all these years? And
I don't think I could.
No, maybe you couldn't come back to a new run. I mean, because it's been so long now. It's one of these
If
things.
David and Brian and Bill joined me, I would do
You would
it.
consider it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there you heard it
Wow.
first. So there you go. So David, I was going to ask you. You know, Kabuki was such an ambitious series.
Wow.
You know, it was like your first kind of creator-owned. I mean, was it one of these things where you had an opportunity to kind of show off? Not show off, but I mean to kind of boil down all of your influences and go, you know, this is all the stuff I love, and I want to put it all into my own series. You know, talk us through a little bit about the genesis of Kabuki.
Yeah, I don't think I had it as thought out as that in terms of trying to show off or anything, but I think it was a sense of, for me, comics were a medium that, you know, I liked doing a lot of things. You know,
Yes.
I liked making all kinds of art. I liked
Yes.
writing stories, telling stories. I loved storytelling, film. And for me, comics were like a medium that I felt like could unite all other mediums.
Yeah.
And it was when I discovered doing comics that I felt like, oh, that's the thing I can choose.
You can express
because-
yourself the best.
Yeah, anything
Comics,
else.
anything else, you can do it, but comics is the one that gives you the most freedom as an
Yeah,
artist.
and I also felt like all of those other things I like, I could integrate them into it. You know, it could
So
absorb.
things like painting and multimedia.
Yeah, I think comics in a way are sort of like rock and roll, where it's like a hybrid art form that is stale when it copies itself, but when it is absorbs from outside itself and integrates, it becomes full of life. You know, it's like that kind of medium. And anytime like you're inspired by something and pulling into that
Yes.
that hybrid medium,
Yes.
it's really fascinating.
Yes.
But when you're trying to redo something that's already done, it becomes a little stale.
Yes.
And I felt like it was also kind of like a playground for me, but also kind of a laboratory where I could kind of tell personal stories.
Yes.
And work out personal stuff. You know, that I did that Kabuki story when I started it when I was in college. And I can look back now and I can see that I was probably processing and working out a lot of issues.
So
that I
stuff
had.
publicly as an artist, but
Yeah.
like, was that quite cathartic for you as an artist?
It was.
To say, look, I want to see how far I can push this.
Yeah, and I think so you know, you're kind of tempted when you want to tell a personal story. Well, I loved like Harvey Picar's American Splendor.
Because it
or,
was autobiographical.
I loved autobiographical comics, like
Yes.
you know, Robert Crumb and
Yes.
Joe Matt's Peep Show and Ivan Brunetti's Schizo, and there were these, you know, it's comics where people tell very personal, kind of give too much information
Yes.
about themselves. Ivan Brunetti would tell a story about where he goes to
Or
work.
Joe Matt. Did you ever read Joe Matt's
yes,
Peep Show,
yes,
which was
yes.
incredibly personal
Yes.
and perhaps a little
Well,
bit uncomfortable at
Ivan
times?
Brunetti would write a
Yes.
script where he's talking about that he's lusting after one of his coworkers and how he
Yes.
wants to kill his boss.
Yes.
And he puts it in the comic, and you know, cut to the next issue, they saw it and he's been fired.
Oh.
You know, that was the level of reality. And I was so young that I didn't feel fully formed as a human to be able to think that I could do objective, you know, autobiographical
Storytelling.
comics. And I also I felt too self-conscious to do it.
Yes.
So
you created this kind of like an analog to use. To
yeah,
tell
well, yeah.
stories
Well, I thought
effectively.
if the main character was a male figure, I would fall into the trap of making an idealized version of
yourself.
myself.
Yes.
And so I thought I'll make the character a different gender and put them in a different culture in a different part of the world. And that way it'll give me kind of a mask or a veil that I could feel more free to express without
Yes.
people thinking it's me,
Yes.
but hopefully make a certain amount of it universal enough for people to be able to look at it and see themselves.
Of course.
And not see me, but relate to
Yes,
themselves.
yes.
And that'll give me the freedom
Yes.
to
Yes.
you know how you kind of said like unconsciously stuff kind of reveals itself in the story, like the large bottle or whatever, it kind of reveals itself in the process, and you kind of work with that. I wanted to create that kind of playground, for myself.
Yes.
And that's what the Kabuki story, became for me.
Yes.
I just did it. There was a certain amount of consciousness in it, and there was a certain amount of unconscious that you're dancing with, while you're doing it.
Okay. I mean, you've had a very unusual career. I mean, you worked for the State Department as is it like a cultural ambassador? Is that a fair comment?
Yes.
So, I mean, it's a very different thing to being an artist or a writer. I mean, how does that fit in, with your creative life, I guess?
It opened up my world, to a lot of other worlds and cultures and perspectives, which I do feel like enriches my writing and my art and in my work. And you also you're able to use storytelling and images as kind of a bridge to communicate to other kind of people. Like, traveling for the U.S. State Department, I was in like the former Soviet areas in 2016, 2017, 2019. I was in North Africa in 2017, 2019. I was in Asia. I started traveling under the Obama administration. But I did so many different kinds of things. But I would be in refugee camps.
Yes.
I spoke at like youth prisons. There were like a variety of agendas that different parts of Washington would have, and then I would do these interesting things. When I was in North Africa, I was in Tunisia, and it's right next to Libya. And currently, since Benghazi, Libya is kind of two warring military factions that each think of themselves as the government, but they're just like two extremist militias. But they're recruiting young people from the neighboring borders to join their ranks. And the agenda was, it was actually under CVE, which is Countering Violent Extremism. And the agenda was to interact with at-risk youth and make them less susceptible to recruitment from extremist groups. So they would drive me around in an embassy vehicle, which was like a bulletproof SUV.
So you were a target, basically, for potential.
Well,
you were. To be honest, if you're an American, you represented the American government. You were a target.
So I would teach at schools on the border,
yes,
near
between Libya and Tunisia.
Yeah, and try to show them what I was doing and remind people of the positive things out there, and try to incline them to a creative or positive direction, and make them less susceptible from the other pressures that they would be facing.
I mean, the political thing. I mean, did you feel? I mean, that must be incredibly difficult, because obviously you're going there, on kind of a very positive mission. But did you ever feel like you're being pulled in different directions, and you were worried that the State Department might have had a different kind of agenda? And I'm not really. But I'm saying it must be difficult because you're working. You're kind of also effectively working in politics in a way.
Most of the time. Yeah, most of the time it felt like very positive situations. There were definitely moments where things were strange.
I mean, were you ever under fire? I have to ask this, because you're in dangerous places sometimes. Were there ever occasions where you thought, bloody hell, I'm going to get out of this? Or, I mean, serious question, because this is dangerous work sometimes. You're in places where things are unstable. So were there occasions where you were either a target or you thought, this is the end, I've had a good run?
So often a certain amount of things were public, and were specifically public to kind of like, show the U.S. Embassy or State Department's commitment to like minority groups on the borders, or other things. But every now and then they would have something that they call non-branded events, where they don't want anyone to know that the embassy or the State Department is aiding in that situation, because they don't want the people who go to that situation to face recrimination from whoever's in charge. And there was a grassroots Libya Comic-Con that was created by Libyan
That's amazing.
Comic-Con people.
Through people who've met you, partly, or they're partly inspired.
The first year they did it on their own, and they did a pretty good job. But then the second year they were doing it, and the State Department was covertly aiding them in the Libya Comic-Con, and I was to speak at the Libya Comic-Con, and we were working in advance. Before Zoom, there's like a State Department version of Zoom where you see all the different people on the thing, and we're talking to all the organizers in Libya, but also the people in the U.S. and the people in the Libyan embassy at that time Benghazi had been overrun, so they were operating out of Tunis and Tunisia. And we're working with these organizers, and you know these things are happening, but they filled out all the proper forms and everything to have the Libya Comic Con. I guess from one militia group, but I guess the other militia group still raided the Libya Comic Con with AK-47s and arrested everybody. They saw people with badges and they thought maybe that was like the important people.
Seriously?
But they didn't realize everybody had a badge. So they arrested everybody, and many of them were released fairly soon, but even some of them were like
they were kept hostage basically for a number of months.
Most people were who were just attendees. Some of them were beaten and had their heads shaved, but were released pretty quickly. But there were like 5 to 6 people who. The short story is, as far as I know, nobody died, and they were released 2 months later, but were beaten and tortured, and there was a moment where I was trying to get any information. I would get messages of like, hey, my
how's
brother
your friend doing or something.
Yeah, it was like my brother's been arrested and he's diabetic, and we're trying to get his medication to them
to find out where he was.
And then every time I would get a message from somebody, I would stop what I was doing and try to get their full names and their list of medical needs and send that to the State Department. But also I do work with PEN America, who's here in New York also, and would send it to them so they could put political pressure on the UN to give them legal advocacy as well as their medication. And I would be like, okay, I've got 5 names and here's the full names, and the embassy would be like, oh, we only have 4 names, and I would say, here's what, and I would just give them whatever information. So every now and then there had been some tense moments like that. And also, like in the former Soviet areas, I was in the country of Georgia. It's right next to Armenia, Azerbaijan. It's near Iran and Turkey.
One of the former republics.
Yeah, but it's still occupied. Like 20-25% of it's still occupied by Russia from their last invasion in 2008. So it was already a very tense situation in certain parts of it. And Russia would they have like this big barbed wire fence on wheels, so they would kind of they would keep messing with their territory,
like a mobile border.
A mobile border, and sometimes it would cut off the interstate, and you'd have to go through Russian checkpoints and stuff. So they were always sort of antagonizing the situation.
Are you quite a calm person then?
Most of the time.
Are you calmer now than you were before you started? I guess you have to be really chilled about stuff like this.
Well,
they were stuck in things, and you realize.
So this is during Obama. So this is before we heard about like all the Russian hacking and everything. But when I was there, like none of my laptop and phone, nothing worked the same way. Like I could tell something was weird about it.
Tampered with, basically.
I would email like the embassy guy his .gov address, and they would all bounce back. So I would contact him a different way. And I was like, hey, are you getting any of my emails? He's like, oh, the Russians are always fucking with our emails. And I would be like, oh man, like, I gotta already assume the State Department's in my emails. Now the Russians are in my emails, so there was stuff like that.
Did you do a bit of misinformation? Did you know the Russians were playing, you go, actually, that meeting we've got, by the border with those 3 guys, is it
there were, well, I'll say, there were moments where I word this carefully, where I said, like, I would have a very tight schedule. I might be teaching in a whole bunch of different cities in one day, and then I would go to some like art thing, and then they would.
Were you followed at all?
Well,
where you have people following? I mean, seriously.
Right. Yeah. No. So
Russian, government people that were kind of at the show. There was this guy at the back, or.
Yes. So there would be moments where I was scheduled to have interviews with various journalists and so on, and then teach another class somewhere else. And I came to the guy, hey, by the way, at this thing, this journalist from Kyrgyzstan and this journalist from Uzbekistan, kept insisting that we have to do an interview together, but they're not on the list, and they're like,
they seem a bit fishy, basically.
It seems unusual, and they're like, very attractive. And
like a honey trap almost.
That's what he said. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry.
And so
and
he was like, oh, that's interesting, And I was like, so obviously I avoid that, right? He was like, oh no, you definitely go to that meeting.
Well, he wants you to go and see these people.
Yeah, and he would say, like, if they ask you about Putin, just say that you're in an apolitical context.
And the other one, I'm not commenting politically because I'm here on a cultural basis.
Yeah.
Wow. So how much of this stuff ends up in your work? It's an incredibly rich vein. Let's be honest here.
So Brian Bendis and I were collaborating on another creator-owned project, and I was telling him about certain experiences, and he immediately said like, hey, this thing we're doing, let's do this thing later. Let's do this story right now, and that became a creator-owned comic series.
About Cover.
Yeah, it's called Cover, and we.
So obviously that's a heavily fictionalized version of your experiences, but there is at the kernel there are things that are based on real life experiences for yourself.
Right. Yeah.
I won't dig any further.
Well, no, I was very resistant to it because I thought, oh, in the future I'll tell like a very non-fiction memoir.
I mean, like you write your book, you write your story of your life.
Yeah, but then like it was really, I was resistant because there was a lot of ways to do it wrong, and however you have to get the tone just right to make it work. But I felt like we got the right tone, and it became its own thing.
Yes, exactly.
And yeah, it was a really.
I'm going to ask you a more mundane question and move on to Klaus. So you've worked on television, you worked on the credits for Jessica Jones, a lot of concept work. So I mean, how did you find working in television? How was it different to working in comics?
Yeah, it's kind of. I've tried a lot. I've been directing music videos. I worked on the credits. I did the art for the main titles of the Winter Soldier film. It's every time I've done something, it's been different from the other one. Yeah.
I mean, is it heavily micromanaged by people, or does it depend on the company?
There's like a certain level of micromanagement, but I usually feel pretty free to do. They're usually asking you to do something for a reason.
And it's heavily art directed, so they give you a brief. They say, obviously we've hired you because we like your work. You're doing the credits, and you get quite a tight brief.
Well, for instance, with the Winter Soldier film. I had done a talk in Barcelona at a design conference, and would eat with the other designers there and become friends with them and so on. And I got this. I was just about to head on a plane out of the country, and they're like, "Hey, we've worked with the Russo brothers before, and they're going to be doing the next Captain America film, and I have this design firm, and we met in Barcelona, but I know you do comics. I don't know anything about comics, but." We asked the Russo, could we do the credits? And they said, no, we already got someone doing the titles. And they go, well, can we just send you some examples? And he goes, well, okay, send us a few examples, but you're probably not going to get it. And so her name was Erin Swarovski, and she said, okay, so my design place is going to make 5 pitches, but but if you want to make a pitch also, I'll turn it in with my 5 pitches, and if they choose your pitch, we'll collaborate on it together. And I said, okay, great. And she's like, I was like, when do they need this pitch? Like, like in 2 days, So, on the plane ride, I was like on a 12-hour plane ride or something. I was drawing the whole time, all my ideas, and then, when everyone else was scuba diving and stuff, I was inking the stuff and took a photo with my iPhone and sent, and that film that comes at the end of the film, and it's all these really bold black and white. It's very inspired by Saul Bass designs, Vinci Steranko designs, Yes. And because I got the sense that the film was like a very sort of international espionage kind of film, so I was going with those big bold black and white shapes, like a 70s style.
Interesting.
And so they ended up choosing the pitch that I sent, and some of those initial images made it to the final thing. Yeah,
that's amazing.
But then once it was selected, then there was kind of do 10 versions of everything.
You have to get them rendered, you have to get them a bit more sophisticated.
Exactly.
For the
I had to read. Yeah, they had not given me any of the assets for that film. They didn't give me when I did the pitch, I didn't have the exact. When I would make planes, they were regular planes. They're like, okay, the one where you have the planes, it's got to be this.
So it's almost like an abstract. So it's like
an
abstract version of what you thought would be in the film, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So, Klaus, I want to go back.